More than any other natural ecosystem, the river has played a vital role in shaping man's history. Rivers create and maintain fertile soil. They provide abundant water, and they host an intricate variety of life. The vast biological diversity of the river valley depends upon a delicate balance of forces supported by the natural cycle of flooding. However, flooding is becoming dangerously over-controlled, if not eliminated, through man's misuse of his environment. By examining the plants, animals, and physical processes which depend upon the natural flooding cycle, it is possible to understand just how essential this phenomenon is to a healthy riverine ecosystem. Far from being detrimental, flooding is a beneficial and renewing force.
Each river in the world is a unique system, but from any one it is possible to make important generalizations. The Connecticut River, for instance, which originates in New Hampshire and forms the border between New Hampshire and Vermont, running down through Massachusetts, finally through Connecticut to the Long Island Sound, is approximately 400 miles in length. Now, like all natural systems, rivers must obey physical laws, and the most important of these is the process by which energy is dissipated, the energy of the flowing water. If we look at this region of the map in more detail over here, when the river is in a straight run, this energy dissipation is by down-cutting, forming deep canyons on each side. But when the river enters the floodplain, which is relatively level, the energy has to be dissipated in another way, and this process is by lateral cutting, which forms these curves or meanders.
With its source in the Connecticut Lakes of New Hampshire, the Connecticut River in the first 30 miles drops more than 1,300 feet, about half of its total descent to the sea. Continuing more leisurely on its 400-mile journey southward, the river proceeds through a remarkable series of floodplains warranting the historic name intervales. Falls or rapids separate each of these floodplains from the next. The main stem of the river is fed by hundreds of tributaries, each adding to the natural diversity of the river basin. Many streams originate in upland bogs and marshes which are able to hold vast amounts of water. Like giant sponges, these wetlands gradually release water to sustain the river's flow during dry spells. Continuing to increase in size as it flows southward, the main stem in Massachusetts and Connecticut develops large meanders in a wide floodplain. The Indian word Connecticut means long tidal river, a fitting name since ocean tides affect the last 60 miles from Hartford to the Long Island Sound. Because the river is near sea level for such a distance, a complex series of marshes is formed by the many freshwater streams that join the main stem. Near the Connecticut's mouth, these freshwater marshes grade into saltwater marshes and form the estuary. Scientists estimate that no less than 80% of man's total harvest from the sea is dependent upon these estuarine nurseries. An expert on marsh ecology, Dr. William Nearing, together with Zell Stever, are studying the delicate relationship of river and estuary. Each winter, the vegetation dies back and is later converted by bacteria into rich sediments. The river's floodwaters not only wash out excess salts, but also stir up bottom sediments in the shallow bays, which the incoming tide deposits on the marsh. Using this rich manure, a mat of algae blooms beneath the grasses and on the adjacent mudflats. This luxuriant organic matter provides food for amphipods, snails, mussels, and many other animals. The edge of the marsh merges into the bays, which support an entirely different array of life. Returning from the ocean deeps, young eels share small channels with such life as killifish and shrimp. Rhythmically extending feathery legs like casting a net, barnacles entrap small animals and organic fragments while the tide is in. Mussels and other shellfish provide food for mammals and seabirds. Flooding, considered by many to be a catastrophic extreme, is in fact the lifeblood of the estuary. Acting both as a flushing mechanism and depositional device, floodwaters transport nutrients to and from the marshes. Any change in the flooding cycle could trigger deleterious effects to the dynamic balance of the entire estuary.
It is imperative to learn more about the interrelationship of the geological process of flooding and biological productivity. Earlier, we talked about how meander cutting cut down the bank on one side of the river, eroding it away. Well, the fact is that this very process of cutting creates the habitat where bank swallows nest. And these birds, in turn, capture countless midges over the backwaters and over the river itself. Now, if we look at this map of the floodplain, we can gain an idea of how the process of cutting has moved the river about in time. And we can compare this topographic map with this aerial map here. This bank has been built out over the past years. The old Northampton Ferry used to leave from this point here. Now the bank of the river is way down here. And at the same time that it has been depositing on this side of the river, it has been cutting away over here. And this is, in fact, where the bank swallow nests we saw are. And as the river moves around this way, it's cutting on this side to the east and depositing on this side. Now, as long as there are no dams on the river and the normal silt load comes down, when the river cuts on this side, it takes away land on one side but gives it back on the other so that the net change is zero. This is called Rainbow Beach and has been built out by this process. Over here, the process of cutting has cut off the old Fort River channel at this point here, so that the river, which used to meander about here, now enters here, and so the old channel is completely cut off. Moving down the river, we see where, through the course of time, a wide meander had formed and became so unstable that during a heavy flood in the 1840s, it actually cut through the neck and isolated the old channel, which is called an oxbow. And if we look over here, we can see an even older oxbow. And in fact, if we look at the contour of the plowed fields, we can see how the farmers have plowed along the old channel of the river as it has changed.
The basis of the spring flooding is winter precipitation throughout the basin. Because of the prolonged period of cold New England weather, large amounts of snow and ice accumulate. The life system of the river soon reaches its most dormant state. Early spring thaws begin to melt the masses of snow and ice. Spring rains add even more water to the melting snow. Much of the meltwater cannot soak into the still frozen ground, and thus feed the tributaries and main stem with an increasingly larger volume of water. Melting during the day, followed by freezing at night, prolongs the flooding period and in some years leads to gradual runoff. In other years, when heavy spring rains cause a rapid melt-off, more extensive flooding occurs. With the rising water, the winter ice begins to break up. Often, great ice jams form, leading to local flooding. Even after the snow has disappeared from most parts of the valley, runoff from the mountain headwaters continues to feed the main stem, thereby sustaining the flood. Much of the energy contained in the rapidly flowing river at whitewater areas cuts the channel deeper and grinds the rocks to smaller particles. The fast-moving water carries these particles as the sediment load into the fully flooding river. In the floodplain, the power of the water revitalizes the meandering process. Cutting on the outer side of the bend undermines the old floodplain forest and picks up more sediment. That which is not deposited downstream is added to the increasing sediment load of the floodwaters. The continued rise of the water finally overtops the banks as the river reclaims its floodplain at full flood. The true nature of floodplains now becomes evident. They are actually part of the river with which they are in a state of dynamic equilibrium. As the fast-moving water spills out and spreads across the floodplain, its velocity diminishes and its load-carrying capacity rapidly drops off. A new layer of sediments is deposited on the floodplain. In exchange, the floodwaters pick up dead plant materials. This organic matter gets carried back to the main stem by the receding flood. Accumulating in various parts of the river channel, it becomes a major source of food, sustaining the riverine food chains throughout the whole year. There has evolved a complex interdependence between organic input and the riverine bacteria, fungi, and other organisms which decompose it. This natural relationship gives rivers the ability to assimilate great amounts of waste materials, provided, of course, that the decomposer system is not overloaded. The sediments left behind on the floodplain consist of minerals carved and carried by the river and deposited together with organic materials. In the spring of 1936, the largest recorded flood of the Connecticut River added nearly 1.5 inches of sediments to many floodplains. The long-term effect of this sediment deposit is the continued renewal of rich and fertile soils. The riverine ecosystem provides diverse habitats and supports many food chains which form a rich web of life. Dr. Ruth Patrick, a distinguished American scientist, has analyzed many aspects of freshwater biology.
It brings with it a lot of nutrients. Any natural stream, you know, has a great many different kinds of algae in them.
Algae pick up vital nutrients released by the decomposer's activities, and by capturing the energy of sunlight, are important primary producers at the base of the riverine food chain. In pools, snails graze on an algal blanket. Caddisfly larvae graze too. They cope with the current by living in specially constructed cases. Stonefly nymphs feed upon the finer layers of algae growing on the rocks. The activities of these grazers dislodge fragments of algae which drift downstream to be captured by sponges, primitive animals which depend upon filtering organic matter from the water. Living in small tubes from which they also collect drifting food particles, midge larvae are a vital link in the riverine food chain. They in turn are fed upon by small but voracious water beetle larvae. Along the edge of the river, gerrid bugs await the emergence of the midges and other small aquatic insects, which they will seize, paralyze, and eat. The eat and be eaten axiom of ecology is carried on by dragonfly nymphs, themselves extremely important food for many different kinds of fish. Having assumed nuptial coloration, common shiners perform their mating ceremony over a pebbly nest. The nest was probably made by the larger creek chub, which now extracts payment by eating some of the shiner's eggs as they are laid. Smaller black-nosed dace lurk on the outside, also eating the shiner's eggs. Water snakes in the next level of the food web feed in turn upon these fish, as do marsh hawks, otters, and even the magnificent fish hawk or osprey. Nurtured by the flood, riverine food chains are threads of life which become woven into an intricate and complex web, the true fabric of ecology. When flooding occurs, the floodplain assumes its natural role of holding excess waters. Numerous cut-off river channels, such as the old Fort River, fill to their brims. The water in these channels is considerably enriched with a year's growth of organic matter. As the main stem flood recedes, the channels become active again and the enriched floodwaters flow back into the river. But not all the water runs directly back. Low areas of the old channels trap the floodwaters and form isolated spring ponds. These cannot sustain a fish fauna because they dry out in a matter of weeks. Their ephemeral character makes these vernal ponds ideal habitats for another life-supporting series of food chains. A whole host of freshwater zooplankton and phytoplankton occurs together with nymphs of damselflies, mayflies, and many other invertebrates. Early in the spring, wood frogs chorus and lay masses of eggs. Later, American toads migrate from the adjacent forests to breed by the thousands. Thus, flooding not only transports nutrients from the floodplain to the river, but it also revitalizes specialized aquatic breeding habitats throughout all the floodplain. Development must proceed rapidly, and the tadpoles quickly metamorphose to tiny toads just in time as the ponds dry out. Flooding performs yet another essential function. Much of the floodwater filters into the soil adjacent to the river, and later reappears as purified spring water. By this storage and release mechanism, the river augments its own low flow during dry months, assuring a continuity of life. In addition to maintaining these surface springs, floodwaters also recharge deep subterranean reserves called aquifers, which may contain vast supplies of water. During meander formation, floodwaters deposit sediment on the inner side of the curve, building new land out into the river to form a point bar. Coarser and larger amounts of sediment are deposited in times of heavy flooding. Smaller floods leave finer silts and more organic material. Different species of trees seem to favor different soil bands, and as their seedlings colonize the new formed land, point bar ecological succession results. Willows and cottonwood trees are among the first to grow and are followed by many other species as the bottomland forest becomes reestablished. All of these trees have evolved in the riverine environment and tolerate the periodic inundation of the floodwaters. Together, they constitute a very different flora from the well-drained and often steep valley slopes. Floodplain trees require flooding, whereas upland trees cannot tolerate floodwaters at all. Once a meander becomes unstable, the next large flood cuts it off, forming an oxbow, and another kind of ecological succession begins. Silt and debris dropped in successive flood years, together with sediment deposition by streams, gradually fill in the open oxbow lake. From its inception, the oxbow develops an aquatic flora very different from that in the moving river. The white water lily appears first along the shallower edges, and later is followed by the yellow pond lily and the blue pickerel weed. Next in the succession come grasses and sedges, and then a shrub zone. Eventually, enough soil builds up to support trees. Black willows, cottonwoods, and silver maples migrate toward the center. As the vegetation dies back each year, it too hastens the filling in process. Each successive plant species generates new habitats supporting different invertebrates and other animals. In the course of ecological succession, the lake becomes a pond, and eventually a marsh. Finally, as in point bar succession, a mature riverine bottomland forest results. But the forest does not last forever, for the meandering river will eat it away and begin anew the process of ecological succession. Viewing the river over thousands of years, we can see it writhing about in its floodplain, constantly generating ecological succession. This continuing cycle of point bar and oxbow lake formation maintains a much greater diversity of life than would be possible without natural flooding. Among this living diversity are familiar wildflowers and ferns. Early in the spring, skunk cabbage makes its appearance in the wetter areas. Nearby, the trout lily blooms. In drier portions of the bottomland, ostrich ferns send up this year's fronds. The purple trillium captures the sunlight of early spring before the forest canopy leaves make their full appearance. Bluets and wild geranium found on higher slopes also grow extensively in the floodplain, whereas the pink lady slipper orchid avoids the floodplain entirely. Beavers reappear as spring advances in the river basin. Playing an extremely important role on smaller tributaries, beavers cause the formation of diverse aquatic habitats. Water flows continuously through their dams. Sooner or later, a large flood will wash the dams away and allow wetland ecological succession to occur. The high waters of spring coincide with mass migratory movements of birds, which use the river valley as a passage to the north. During this crucial journey, many different species of waterfowl pause to rest and eat in the secluded backwaters along the main stem. Here, preliminary courtship behavior is evident in regimented swimming patterns. Ducks exhibit remarkable ecological diversity in the way they obtain food. Ringnecks are omnivorous and feed on damsel and dragonfly nymphs, water lily bulbs, pond weeds, and tadpoles, which they dive to obtain. Other ducks, such as the common merganser, also dive, but concentrate on capturing larger fish. Mallards don't dive at all, but rather are dabbling ducks and feed in shallow waters. Canada geese share the bounty of the floodplain while using the river and its backwaters for resting places during their long migration to northern breeding grounds. The river is a transportation route for land birds, too. The bordering forests of the river valley, as well as the floodplain forest, host thousands of migratory songbirds on their journey from the tropics. Waves of warblers fill the trees and devour countless insects. With the waning of the major flood flow, shad migrate upstream to spawn. Born in the river 3 to 4 years previously, they have since reached maturity in the Atlantic Ocean. Now a popular sports fish, the American shad was an important food for settlers in New England Indian tribes. Prior to the advent of the 18th and 19th century industrial dams on the Connecticut River, the shad, together with its cousin, the Atlantic salmon, bred extensively in the main stem tributaries. Today, countless numbers of shad prematurely enter the scavenger's food chain. The dams, which lack adequate fish passageways over them, largely block the exhausted shad and have been responsible for the regional extinction of the salmon. In many places, man is still in harmony with the flooding cycle of the river. Following the gradual withdrawal of the water, he joins the productivity cycle of nature. The soil, with its renewed nutrients brought by the flood, dries sufficiently to be prepared for cultivation. Tobacco is planted extensively throughout the southern part of the Connecticut Valley. Crops of all sorts, such as asparagus, are grown on the extensive floodplains. From silage hay to vegetables of many varieties, the floodplains provide the ideal growing medium for large amounts of high-quality agricultural produce. Few people are aware of the grave dangers that face riverine ecosystems throughout the world. At Amherst College, digital computers are used to study man's effects on the Connecticut River. They can also simulate the consequences of any plans to alter the river's natural state. Past flow patterns gathered at various points along the river can be displayed graphically. The average flow can be computed on a weekly basis or using the same data on a daily basis, which reveals a truer picture of man's manipulation of the river.
We see on this mean weekly flow graph, beginning in January of the year, coming through the spring, the flood builds up and then slacks off by June, and the flow is pretty low for the rest of the year.
Right.
But it's very even. Now, if we look at the daily flow data, we see that there's a far greater fluctuation in it, and it comes down, way, way down, practically to zero. And now we've used exactly the same data that we use down here to produce this daily graph, but the daily flow graph is completely different, showing this extreme fluctuation. Why is that?
In the first graph, by taking weekly values, we lump together all the fluctuations which have a tendency to cancel out. On this graph, you can see a dip on a weekly basis. What in essence is going on, the utilities are shutting off the flow of the river every weekend, particularly on Sunday, in order to hold back water for hydro production during the week. So every 7 days, you see the river flow go virtually to zero. And
So
then pick up.
that the river, in fact, is being turned on and off like a water faucet?
Right, exactly.
The flow of the Connecticut River and many of its main stem tributaries is severely disrupted by numerous power dams. The extent of flooding has also been diminished by many flood control dams.
Well, I've watched the cycle of flooding here in this marsh for quite a few
Roby
years.
Hubley, director of the Arcadia Wildlife Sanctuary, is concerned about the future of the biological diversity in the basin.
The water rises here generally in late April or early May, and standing right where we are, the water in a normal flood year is 8 or 10 feet over our heads. The shallow areas, of course, are the most sensitive, and they're also the most productive all along the river. And the greatest effect of the dams would be on these sensitive, productive, shallow areas, and it would reduce their operating efficiency. It would change the way they operate completely. So I think that would very likely result in a conspicuous reduction of the life in the river, the living things in the river, the fish, the insects, and the whole organic chain in the river. The tendency in attempting to analyze a stream is to isolate it into segments, and like one dam at a time. But you can't do that. You have to analyze what any dam is going to do in terms of how it relates to what happens upstream and downstream. I think if you project the changes in the river that are being made by man to an endpoint, what you see is really a river running through a pipe or running through a canal.
Over the past 2 centuries in the Connecticut River Basin, several hundred dams have been built, including 16 main stem hydroelectric and 12 major flood control dams. Over 200 additional dams in the next 50 years have been proposed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, power companies, and the U.S. Soil Conservation Service.
While our population doubles, our demands triple. Environmental resources are treated as if they were infinite. They are not. The signs of environmental degradation are now obvious to us all. No longer can conservation be considered a luxury. The principal message of modern ecology is this: man and his activities are reducing biological diversity to an extent which is generating unstable environments throughout the world. We must come to grips with this problem. We cannot afford rhetoric, for our own future is at stake.
Man is totally dependent upon complex ecosystems. From the beginning of civilization, we have relied on the biological diversity of rivers and their fertile valleys. The ever-changing riverine landscape from the headwaters to the sea owes its very existence to the natural cycle of flooding.